Welcome to Stranger Encounters. I am Tommy Salmons. Today's guest is Michael Maharrey. I asked Michael to come on after going through his audiobook of entitled Our Last Hope, about rediscovering the lost path to liberty. It's about nullification and the history of nullification and the constitutionality of nullification. Michael, on top of being an author of Our Last Hope, is a communications director for the 10th Amendment, managing editor of the Schiff Gold blog. He hosts his own podcast, Thoughts from Maharrey Head, as well as Friday Gold Wrap and It's Your Dime. He's also authored Smashing Myths, Understanding Madison's Notes on Nullification, The Power of No, and some articles, and he works as a journalist as well. So I'm sorry that this intro sounds a little off. I'll be completely honest. This is the morning before, early in the morning. I haven't finished my coffee. I am human. I have to squeeze these things in whenever I can, and today happens to be the wife's birthday, so y'all are getting zombie Tomby. Oh, Jesus. I need to stop. All right. Anyway, let's get on with the show, man. All right. I'm here with Mike Maharrey, the author of Our Last Hope, and a great article I read today. What's going on, Mike?
Not a whole lot. We're here in cloudy and dreary central Kentucky, so it's I'm kind of sleepy, to be honest. So yeah. We'll get this going. Will get me excited and stuff and wake me up.
Yeah, there we go. Nullification is one of those exciting topics, I find.
Well, yeah, it really is, actually.
To people who understand it.
Half the audience just went to sleep.
Yeah, exactly. Half the audience don't know what we're talking about.
No, yeah, they'll find out, right?
Exactly. But first thing I want to get into this article I just read by you about socialism. I found it really interesting, like your perspective on that, and how you view like is innocent and as well intentioned as the modern day democratic socialists or socialist Democrats, whatever you want to call them, as well intentioned as they plan on being, or as they seem to be, that the policies that they're projecting onto the nation and that mimetic drive is what leads to the horrid outcomes of socialism. And how does that work? How does that conclusion come about?
Well, I think it's because of the foundation that their ideas are laid upon, that most of them won't acknowledge, and I don't even think really recognize in their own mind. And the article that you're referring to, you probably saw it on the Mises Institute website. I actually originally published it on a website called Godarchy, which is at godarchy.org. It's a kind of a side project that I have, and it's a Christian-oriented website that kind of explores the intersection between Christianity and the state. And it's really an anarchist Christian perspective. And I know a lot of people in their heads are going to be like, whoa, what? How can you be an anarchist and a Christian? And we don't really need to go into that whole spiel. If you want to check it out, go to godarchy.org.
I get the exact opposite. How can you be an atheist and an anarchist? So don't worry about it.
Well, yeah. You'll like the last episode of my podcast I just did. I actually did a fireside chat with an atheist, a friend of mine, and we kind of talked about our perspectives and tried to find some common ground. It's pretty cool. But anyway, not to get too sidetracked off the topic at hand.
Yeah.
So I was responding actually in that article to a rather prominent Christian thinker who was extolling the virtues of democratic socialism and basically calling them Christian values. And they're not. And the problem is they're only looking at the ends. I think a lot of people that embrace this idea of socialism, they have good intentions. They want what they consider to be justice and equality, and they think they're going to fix the economy, which is absurd because they don't understand economics. But that's really a side problem. The real issue is the fact that what they are advocating rests on a foundation of violence, force, and coercion. And no matter what you're trying to do, if violence and force and coercion is the means towards your ends, your ultimate ends are always going to end up bad. And this is pretty much what I said in the article. If the bottom line is that this program requires 100% buy-in. And those of us who don't want to buy in, those of us who don't want to fund these programs or don't want to be part of this great political experiment, at the end of the day, they are willing to put us in a cage, to force us to participate, and to use the threat of death to do it. And I don't care whether you're a Christian or an atheist or something in between. That is not a moral and ethical and just position to take. And really what I wanted to do with that article and really the whole Godarchy project is intended to strip away this veneer, this goodness, this good intention, the grandfatherly Bernie Sanders or the pretty, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, whatever her name is, to strip that away and to make people understand that behind it, when you pull the veil down, basically what you're left with is a guy with a gun. And I want those people to own their violence because it frustrates the fire out of me that they want to try to stand on the moral high ground when ultimately what they want to do is kill me and take my stuff.
Yes, sir. I completely agree with you. And it's one of those, I guess it's this hubris that maybe we're used to now. And, we're taught to defer to authority. It was something I was actually talking to Scott Horton about the other day about, the problem with your average American citizen isn't that necessarily that they've completely bought into the propaganda of the government as much as it's that all through government schooling, you're taught a deference to authority. And when you defer to authority for your well-being, you're entrusting your livelihood with somebody else, which means that they can extinguish it, do away with it as they please because it's no longer your life to do as with you please. Excuse me.
Yeah, absolutely. I talk about that a lot in context of my work with the 10th Amendment Center. I'm the National Communications Director over there. And, of course, that's more oriented towards political solutions at the state level. And I guess we'll probably get into that more in depth here in a minute. But one of the primary strategies of the 10th Amendment Center is to undermine federal power, to pull federal power back by using other power centers, including states, local governments, and individual action. And I tell people all the time that when you allow the government, because there's a lot of people in America that have this idea that the Constitution gives us rights. The Constitution gave me the right to keep and bear arms. No, that's absurd. The Constitution didn't give you anything. The Constitution was only meant to restrict the government from infringing on a right that you already had. Now, we can debate whether or not that has worked or not, but that was the point. The government doesn't give you rights. And when you get into this idea of deferring to the government, which is exactly what you're talking about, when you defer to the government to give you your rights, well, then you're deferring to the government to take them away too, because you're allowing them to define the extent of your rights. And that's a really, really bad way to think of things. Because if ultimately if we own ourselves, then that means we have all of these rights at our disposal from the moment we're born, and it's up to us ultimately to protect them and not depend upon somebody. I mean, it's ridiculous enough to depend on somebody else to protect them, much less to define them for us.
Yeah, well, exactly. Like you said, it's like, who is the sole owner of these rights and able to dispense of those rights legitimately? Are they your rights? Are they inalienable to you as a person? Or are they the government's, and do they bestow them upon you? And in which case they are no longer rights, they are merely privileges.
Right. I think they're Donald Trump's, actually. He hands them out. That's the way I kind of understand it.
Orange man bad.
Yeah, Orange man bad. Exactly.
Okay. Well, getting into the Constitution, it's a very easy transition into nullification. So for those that aren't familiar with nullification or don't think it as a legitimate solution to the problem, what is nullification? What does this actually mean?
Okay, in order to really explain it, I'm going to have to back up a step even from that and talk a little bit about the constitutional system that was established in the beginning of the American Republic. And I know a lot of the folks that listen to your show are probably ANCAPs and reject the whole idea of a constitution. And fundamentally, I do as well. But I think this provides a useful tool because this is the system that most people claim that they embrace. And this is supposedly the rule of law here in the United States. So it does provide some framework that we can work within. And the Constitution, as it was ratified, was intended to create a relatively limited central government. Now, I don't think anybody's going to argue that that succeeded. But I think part of the reason that it failed was that it was always intended that the states would have far more power in the system than the general government or the national government or the federal government. The federal government was supposed to only exercise a very limited number of powers. You find most of those in Article 1, Section 8, where we find the powers delegated to Congress. If you look at that list, it's not very big. Some people, it depends on how you count them, but I've heard anywhere between 24 and 30 powers that the federal government actually is supposed to exercise. Now, obviously, they have distorted that, and they control virtually everything in our lives. And the states have been relegated to mere vassals, or almost just like counties as they are to a state. Now, I want to emphasize now, people I'm sure going, oh, well, state governments, they aren't any better. No, they're not any better. But the idea is to decentralize the system. And my philosophy is that the more you concentrate government into a central authority, the more dangerous it is to liberty. So I don't like state governments either, but at least there's 50 of them, and at least that there's some competition between them. And if things get really, really bad here in Kentucky, I can move to Tennessee. I don't know why in the world I would ever do that. Or, maybe I can move to Texas or, move to Florida. There at least is some ability to move and there creates some competition among jurisdictions. When you have everything concentrated at the central federal level, then there ain't no place to go. It controls everything. And I think monopoly government is antithetical to liberty. So as a first step, I think that decentralizing the system is one practical way that we can at least get a little bit more liberty, start moving in that direction. And interestingly, people like Murray Rothbard actually agreed with this. He talked about the value of the 10th Amendment. Hans Hermann Hoppe wrote an essay where he talked about decentralizing things down to smaller jurisdictions and undermining the more general power. So that's kind of what we're trying to do at the 10th Amendment Center. And we use this idea of nullification. And it was actually something that was built into the system from the very beginning. The idea was first actually articulated by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in 1798, when, surprise, surprise, just about 10 years after the Constitution was ratified, the federal government started overstepping its bounds. Shocking, I know. And Jefferson and Madison wrote a couple of documents that were ultimately passed by legislatures in Kentucky and Virginia. They're called the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions of 1798. And they lay out this idea of nullification. And in its simplest form, it's basically that the states created the federal government. Therefore, the states are ultimately the ones that delegated the power to the federal government. Therefore, it is ultimately the states that have the right to determine the extent of that power and to actually step in when the federal government oversteps its bounds. Jefferson put it simply. He said, when the federal government oversteps its powers, the nullification is what he called the rightful remedy. So what is nullification? Well, just to be real quick about it, there's actually two definitions of the word that you can look at. One is a legal definition, basically to nullify something through a judicial edict. So if the Supreme Court strikes down a law, it nullifies that law, it erases it from the book. Then we have what we would call practical nullification. That's just basically making something void or ineffective or unenforceable. And that's really what we focus on with our work at the 10th Amendment Center. The best analogy that I can give you is a speed limit. Speed limit is, say, 55 miles an hour, right? Nobody's driving 55 miles an hour. There is no way in the world that anybody can make you drive 55 miles an hour unless they figure out a way to like put chips in your car that makes your car go in that. But as it is, I've driven. You're in Houston, right?
Not anymore, but yeah, I lived there for a long time.
Okay, I've driven in Houston. There ain't nobody driving no 55. that was the most frightening driving experience in my entire life. We're like bumper to bumper going 85 miles an hour, and you zip by the speed limit sign and like, yeah, that's not happening. That's nullification in effect. Everybody is going against that law. There's no way. The police can pick off one or two people, but there's no way for them to actually enforce that. That is the kind of principle behind what we're doing at the 10th Amendment Center. The federal government depends on states and localities and individuals to enforce virtually all of its laws and implement all of its programs. When states and localities refuse to cooperate, basically they can't do it. And interestingly, James Madison gave this advice before the Constitution was even ratified. When they were debating this, they were saying, yes, the federal government is going to have limited powers. And people were saying, well, how are you going to keep it limited? And in Federalist 46, James Madison said that there were a number of things to do that states could do. And he said one of them was a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. So, this isn't some crazy thing that Mike the anarchist came up with. This is James Madison. People consider him the father of the Constitution. This was his strategy on how to deal with overreaching federal government. The way that we've seen it most effectively work is in marijuana. Today, 33 states have legalized medical marijuana. I think we're up to 10 states now that have just completely legalized marijuana for adult use. The federal government still maintains complete, absolute prohibition of marijuana. There is no way in the world that the federal government can enforce its marijuana laws. And believe me, since 1996, when California first legalized medical marijuana, the federal government has tried to stop this flow. And because of the fact that, number one, states stopped enforcing, and number two, people were willing to use it because they wanted to, the federal government has found it virtually impossible to enforce marijuana prohibition. We want to take this strategy and use it on everything. You can do the same thing with guns. If the gun people had half the balls of the weed people, there would be no federal gun control. All you have to do is just quit enforcing the federal gun laws. The states can quit enforcing the federal gun laws. If Texas would say, you know what, we're not going to enforce this anymore, federal gun laws wouldn't get enforced in Texas. There are not enough ATF agents to do it. But unfortunately, on these more conservative issues, you've got a bunch of Republicans who, as you put it, defer to authority. And, we're going to wait for the Supreme Court to fix things. Well, that's stupid. The Supreme Court's part of the federal government, you moron, and they're not going to fix anything. So this is a way that we can use the power of states, the power of local governments, and the power of individuals to undermine federal authority and break up that top layer of government. No, it's not going to get us liberty. And I can already hear the people, well, even with marijuana legalization, you still got the state laws and they're taxing it. Yeah, I understand that, but at least they're not locking people in cages, right? That's a step forward. And the fact of the matter is the states regulate everything. I mean, they regulate tomatoes, so it's ridiculous to think they're going to suddenly stop regulating marijuana. But one step at a time, break up that centralization, break up that monopoly of power at the top. And I think on a more subtle level, you're also teaching people that it's okay to defy that authority. It's breaking down that mental thing that we've been, indoctrinated into, that we have to defer to the Supreme Court. We have to defer to the President of the United States. We have to defer to the Congress, because no, they're nothing. We don't have to defer to them at all. And nullification teaches that mindset. So that's why I'm involved in the work that I am. I actually came into the liberty movement through the 10th Amendment Center. When I started working with the 10th Amendment Center, I was like a raving neocon. And so sometimes I call the 10th Amendment the gateway drug to liberty. But that's nullification in a nutshell. So that's really what we want to do. We want to use state and local governments to undermine federal power, and we're finding ways to do it on surveillance issues, guns, healthcare, sound money, marijuana, obviously, hemp, all kinds of different issues. Anything that the state does to enforce a federal law or implement a federal program, if the states stop doing it, the federal government's going to have a hard time to accomplish its aims. So that's what we do.
Okay, so I have a couple of things that popped in my head during that, but the first thing I want to do is I want to give you a little pushback that somebody might be thinking that maybe is unfamiliar with nullification, or is just let's just say overly deferential to the state.
Right.
So you use speed limits as an example of going, you go over the speed limit. Now, some people would say, well, does that mean that if you drink and drive, it's nullifying that? Or if you murder somebody, you're nullifying that law? Like, where does nullification end and crime begin?
Well, I would first say to somebody like that, do you really need me to differentiate to you the difference between speeding and killing somebody? I mean, are you really that ignorant? That's funny to me when people, people want to make those kind of extreme examples. I'm a little bit, I guess what I'm saying is I'm a little bit suspect of somebody whose moral compass is guided by dictates from the state. If you need the state to tell you, I've actually heard people say this, they'll say, well, we have to have laws against murder, because if not, I'm just going to go out there and murder some. Well, then you're pretty much a monster, Yeah, exactly. So, I'm not a big fan of this notion that we need government to teach us what is moral and what isn't moral. I think there are much better ways in society of doing that. And if you're treating somebody, in the right way, then, in Christianity, we call it the Great Commission, the Golden Rule. But I don't think you have to be a Christian to believe that, it's not a good idea to hit people and take their stuff. So, that's the first thing that I would say. But the second thing that I would say, the thing about nullification that is powerful as a tool is that it is rooted in the Constitution. So if you are a hardcore statist and you believe in the rule of law, and that's what that's how people will put it. Well, we can't break down the rule of law, Mike. The Constitution is supposed to be the rule of law, right? So, like I said, this isn't Mike Maharrey that made this up. This was Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. I think that they have a little bit of credibility in the creation of this American governmental system. So my argument, my pushback to that kind of pushback is, look, the federal government was limited to a certain number of things. Primarily, it was supposed to be defense, foreign trade, foreign relations. Pretty much everything else was supposed to be left to state governments. Education, healthcare, welfare, roads, all of that stuff was really meant to be handled at the state and local level. Every time that the federal government involves itself in things that are not constitutional, that are outside of its constitutional powers, it is in fact what is being lawless. Nullification is the lawful response to a lawless act. Alexander Hamilton basically said, well, he didn't basically said, he literally said that any law that is not in pursuance of the Constitution is void. Void means it doesn't even really exist. So we're really not doing anything as far as the rule of law goes that is particularly iffy. It is within the right of the states to define their own powers and to push back over and against the federal government when it does things that are lawless. So, my argument back to that is the federal government's the lawless ones. And, again, if you need the government to tell you not to murder somebody, then you're a psychopath, and I don't want anything to do with you anyway.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. But we do live in 2019, the year of hyperbole. So
yes, we do.
We got to ask questions. We got to ask questions like that. Yeah, I'm sure you get it. Sometimes people will call you a neo-Confederate.
Oh, absolutely. I don't even know what that is. Like, people have been calling me that for a decade. I don't understand what it means. Well, what the hell is that? And then you'll get that. Well, Mike, nullification was used for slavery. Well, first off, that's historically not true. That's the funny thing. People that are resistant to a lot of these ideas don't even know history.
Right.
So they'll tell you things, they'll spout off these things like they're facts, and it's not. In fact, the principles of nullification, runaway slaves. And most of the northern states passed what were known as personal liberty laws, and these laws were effectively meant to nullify the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which was a horribly draconian law that took basic due process rights away from anybody who was black that happened to be in the North. You could have a slave catcher show up in Ohio, find any black person on the street, and say, "Hey, this guy was so and so slave," and it was his word against nobody, because that black person wasn't even allowed to testify on his own behalf. And there are documented cases where free black people were hauled back into slavery in the South because somebody just said, "Oh, there's a Negro, we can take them," and they can't do anything about it. And northern states were using this principles of nullification and actually quoting Thomas Jefferson and quoting people like John C. Calhoun to defend their position, saying that the federal government was overreaching by violating these people's Fifth Amendment due process rights. So the truth of the matter is that nullification was actually used in support of runaway slaves. It was never once used to support slavery. Slavery was the law of the land. There was nothing to nullify. So this is just another example of how people get history 180 degrees wrong and then try to use it as some hyperbole and call you a neo-Confederate, which, it's just really kind of dumb. But a lot of that's gone away lately because we've moved away from even really calling it nullification. The cool thing about this, and I probably should have touched on this when I was talking about it earlier, is that the Supreme Court has held, and I'm not one to really give a whole lot of stock to the Supreme Court, but hey, when it gets one right, I'm going to go with it. But the Supreme Court has consistently held since 1842 that the federal government cannot force states to enforce a federal law or implement a federal program. Basically, the argument is that the states, their personnel and resources belong to them, and the federal government cannot commandeer those things to further a federal cause. So basically, if the federal government wants to do something, it has to do it itself. And so what we're talking about is actually rooted in constitutional law. There is no legal limit on the state's ability to push back. Now, you could argue that the states can't actually go arrest a federal agent who is doing something, and I would argue that it would be perfectly okay to do that, but, I'm a radical. But as far as just not cooperating, there's absolutely every ounce of legal principle and doctrine is backing that up. So once again, this idea that it's somehow lawless is actually 180 degrees not true. So that's kind of a cool thing, because what we're talking about doing is actually within the system, at least as far as the lawyers are concerned.
Okay, so you've got me back on the subject. All right, you brought up nullifying gun laws earlier. You also just brought up the fact that some people would tell you that states can't arrest federal agents. Have you heard about Missouri Bill SB 367?
I don't know the bill number off the top of my head. What's the premise?
Okay, so
I might have heard about it, but I don't know the number.
This came out just last month, or 2 months ago. Well, just under 2 months ago, March 19th, 2019. So what it is Missouri banned, or their Congress banned all federal gun control laws, and in this bill, I think the governor still has to sign off on it, which is to be determined.
I don't think it's passed.
Oh, it did not pass?
I think it's still in the. Well, hold on a second.
I think it's still on the floor.
Yeah, I'm going to pull it up. Hold on a second, because we've been tracking this, Bill. And it was interesting because I think an old bill got pulled up that. What was the bill number again?
367.
Senate or House?
Oh, I'd have to get further into the article.
What's the number again?
SB 367. Oh, okay. So it's Senate Bill 367 and then House Bill 786. And they're working together. Apparently, they would prevent all states.
Missouri.
Go ahead.
It's the Missouri Second Amendment. It's called the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act. And yeah, basically what it does is it would do a couple of things. It would declare any federal gun control laws unconstitutional, and then it would also prohibit any state or local resources for the enforcement of these federal gun laws, which again is something that we believe is right down the legal alley. And then I do also believe that it would authorize the arrest of anybody who attempts to enforce such a gun law in the state of Missouri, which I think in practice would be difficult, but more power to them for considering it.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what I was getting at. I was like, that's a hell of a ballsy bill in the 21st century. I mean, that's really exciting to hear states even considering those types of bills in today's age.
And there is precedent actually for arresting federal agents. It has happened on a few occasions. Again, going back to the 1850s, during the height of the fugitive slave era. I know for a fact that there was a rescue of a fugitive slave. The slave catcher, or maybe the owner, or maybe both, came to pick up this guy. I wish I could remember his name off the top of my head. But they grabbed this guy, and basically a mob formed and rescued him, got him in the Underground Railroad, and ushered him off to Canada. And the federal government arrested a bunch of the people that were involved. I think they arrested about 30 or 35 people who were involved in this mob that rescued this runaway slave. And so the sheriffs there in that county in Ohio actually arrested the federal marshals that were involved and charged them with kidnapping. So what ended up happening is they ended up doing a prisoner exchange. And so they never did try to prosecute the feds. That's the problem, is it's difficult to prosecute a federal agent because what happens is they will get the court bounced to federal court, and then the federal court's going to throw it out. It's impossible to keep it in the state system the way the legal process is. But that said, I think there would be a tremendous chilling effect on federal action if federal agents knew for a fact that they were subjecting themselves to the possibility of arrest. And, I'll give you another example that's pretty cool. It's cool on one hand, and then it shows you the absurdity of what the federal government has become on the other. A few years ago, the feds got a bug in their butts about raw milk, and decided that some of these Amish farmers that were selling raw milk and actually, oh my God, selling it across state lines were they were endangering the stability of the United States. So there are a number of cases where Amish farms were raided by federal agents to stop the hideous crime of selling raw milk. And there was one particular farmer up in Elkhart County, Indiana, who was being harassed by the feds. And the sheriff there got wind of the fact that the feds were going to show up and search this guy's farm. So he went out there and actually stood at the end of the road and told him, go home. And they, in fact, got in their cars and went home. So, that shows the power of sometimes all you got to do is face down these bullies. It's like any bully. They exist primarily on the fear and the power that they're able to project. But when you start to undermine that power, then it starts to crumble pretty quick. And so I love these bills, things like this in Missouri. From a political standpoint, will that be too much? Will that keep it from getting passed? I don't know. It is harder to argue within the legal context that you can arrest a federal agent. Like I said, in practice, you're probably never going to prosecute one. But certainly the non-cooperation aspect of it is perfectly legal. And the fact of the matter is, I don't even know that you need to arrest a federal agent. I think if you basically said our state police, our county police, our city police are not going to help enforce any of these laws, I don't think they're going to get enforced. Just look at the way, if you've ever watched on TV, you'll see these big drug raids. And you'll see like one guy with the DEA on his back, and then like 67 sheriff's deputies and local police officers. Well, imagine if the sheriff's deputies and local police officers didn't show up. That one DEA agent ain't gonna walk into that drug house. It's just not gonna happen. So, I think people underestimate just how much the federal government depends on state and local cooperation. And so let's take that state and local cooperation away and let them try.
Do you know, and I mean, it's still pretty much on target here on topic. Do you know what ever happened to the guy who got arrested by the feds for owning a silencer or a suppressor? I think it was in Kansas, when Kansas had passed a law stating that suppressors were okay. And then the feds were trying to extradite a guy from Kansas into federal courts, and the governor of Kansas was like, no, you can't do that. And then they just showed up in the state and arrested the guy. And the governor just stood down.
I'm pretty sure he got prosecuted.
Did he?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that got prosecuted. And this is an example of the problem. You need certain things for this idea of nullification to work. The more it depends upon the government taking some kind of action on your behalf, the less likely it is to succeed. I'll give you an example. In 2006, the Congress passed what is known as the Real ID Act. You may be familiar with it. It's basically a national ID program. At the time, most people threw a fit about it. It was a George W. Bush initiative. A lot of people were creeped out about it because of the civil liberties implications of them being able to track everybody across the country. So privacy issues. A lot of the states were concerned because it was a very expensive program, and the federal government was basically going to mandate that they implement this without providing any type of financial resources to get the job done. So in the aftermath of that, there were about 20 or 25 states that actually passed bills that we are not going to implement this. And we are now in 2019, and the Real ID Act has still not been fully implemented because the states have dragged their feet. So it's a perfect example of how the federal government needs the states. But on the other hand, about 2 or 3 years ago, the will of the states to resist started to crumble for a variety of reasons, mainly because, politicians come and go, and now we've got this immigration crisis. I'm using air quotes around the word crisis. So we want to make sure everybody's got an ID so that we can track these illegals and keep them out. And so we've seen a number of these states actually backtrack, and now they're implementing the Real ID programs. So the problem there is that there was no public will behind it. The reason that the nullification of federal marijuana prohibition has worked fundamentally is because there's enough people in this country that want to use weed, whether for medical reasons or just because they want to get high. And you have to have that public support behind it. And it works a lot better if you're telling the government not to do something. So when you say we're not going to enforce something, that's a lot easier to manage than saying we're going to send our sheriff's deputies out to arrest federal agent, or we're going to protect this guy when he gets a silencer. Those things don't tend to work as well because we're putting too much faith in these government bodies. But it's easier to put faith in them not doing something, if that makes sense, because government's good at not doing things. So that's why we really focus on this idea of anti-commandeering and non-cooperation, because it tends to be more effective. So I was never a big fan of that Kansas law because I had a feeling that when push came to shove, the state was going to leave any individual hanging. And once it gets remanded up into federal court, any strategy that relies on the judicial system to make it work is going to fail in the long run, because the judicial system is the government. Basically you're asking the government to tell the government that the government is wrong.
Yep.
Well, follow the logic there, it's not
self-perpetuating.
going to happen. So, right. So we want to do things where we're basically pulling that cooperation away, not relying on the government to actively protect us.
Well, right. And that was kind of one of my thoughts on that Missouri bill was like, well, I saw this fail in Kansas. Is this actually going to do any better in Missouri? But it is nice to see states at least acting like they're going to stand up, back here in Texas, when Rick Perry stood up and told Obama, hey man, if you don't stop with this BS, we can secede from the union. We don't have to deal with this crap. And, it was just, I actually did call, I can't even think of the guy's name, the governor now. I called his office a while back and told them, I was like, it was really refreshing when Rick Perry stood up to Obama and told him that Texas was willing to secede. And it's really disappointing that you aren't doing the same thing now that Trump's in office. I was like, I just don't understand it. And they just kind of like, yeah, noted, and went on about their business. They don't really care.
Yeah, and this is what's frustrating to me. My biggest frustration in this work of trying to work in the political system is that there's so much emphasis on my team. And at the 10th Amendment Center, we don't have a team. And it's really been interesting because, during the Obama years, we had a lot of Tea Partiers who were big supporters of the 10th Amendment Center. They were all, Obama's doing all these executive orders. We're going to stop them and we're going to nullify all of this and, limit the federal government. Now all of these people are sending me shitty emails because they're mad because they want Trump to do X, Y, and Z. They don't have any principles. They have an allegiance to their Republican Party. Or what's even more sickening is when people get these allegiances to these personalities and they're just, oh, Trump is great. And I'm not Trump deranged. I mean, just from an objective standpoint, Trump is just as crappy as Obama, who's just as crappy as Bush. I don't think he's any more crappy than any of these other guys. And I'm sure the next person, whoever that happens to be, is going to be just as crappy as Trump. But the personality worship that you see in politics is just really gross, because the fact of the matter is pretty much anybody that gets into politics is a sociopath. I mean, that's the kind of personality it takes to want to lord over other people. So, I had to learn, like I said, when I came into the 10th Amendment Center, I was kind of a neocon, and I had to learn. Michael Bolden, the executive director, he told me pretty early on, he said, look, these people are pawns. Don't trust them. You don't have to like them. It's probably better not to, but use them, when they're usable and criticize them when they're not. So, you'll hear us criticize all sides of this, but yeah, the Trump thing is really, really frustrating because, like you said, in states like Texas, Tennessee, Georgia, even states like Missouri, where it's primarily Republican dominated, they're much less willing to push back against the feds right now because, well, their guys got the reins of power and everybody wants the power. My position is we need to get rid of the power because nobody should have it.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. And yeah, you bring up Michael Bolden. I love Michael. What was the story where the Mother Jones journalist wanted to come interview him and walked in with a chip on her shoulder and left loving him because she was like, this hippie wearing these beads and flip flops is running this weird institute out of his apartment.
Right. Bolden and I make a great team because we came from opposite sides of the spectrum because I was the war drum beating neocon, and Bolden actually came. He identified as a legitimate communist at one point in his life, and so we make a great team because I think we can relate to both sides of the political spectrum to some degree. And it's kind of cool because our journeys have taken us to the same place where, we both look at the state and these institutions of government, and we're like, good God, let's get rid of all of this crap because it's not helping anybody. It's like I said, it's a bunch of sociopaths with guns that are wrestling over the right to tell you what to do. And, the lefties are one set of bad and the right wingers are another set of bad. And I don't need any bad. So let's get rid of all these people and do whatever we can to take the tools of power away from them, and bring the power back into our own hands. Because like we start, kind of come full circle. We own ourselves. We are individuals, and nobody has the right to run our lives. As long as we are respecting other people's rights and respecting other people's property and other people's self-ownership, then I think we can all get along just fine. We don't need a bunch of, as Tom Woods likes to say, we don't need a bunch of people with bullhorns yelling at us and directing us in what to do.
Yeah, no, definitely. I want to get back a little bit into the nullification side, and you've brought up the Supreme Court a few times. Now, in today's day and age, it is commonly observed that the Supreme Court is to interpret and enforce the Constitution. But originally, that was not the case. How was the Constitution originally meant to be interpreted? By whom, I guess I should ask.
Well, I'm a proponent of Thomas Jefferson's position, and his position was that anybody who had a position in the federal government had a responsibility to understand the Constitution and to enforce it in the way that they saw fit. I do think that there was an understanding that the Supreme Court would have some power of review. That is part of the checks and balances within the system. And James Madison talked about the Supreme Court being the final arbiter when it came to disputes between the three branches of government. So if you've got Congress looking at something one way and the president looking at something another way, the Supreme Court would be the place that would be understood. Ultimately, though, the states were the creators of the federal government. You look at it like a marriage. A marriage doesn't create a bride and groom. A bride and groom create a marriage. The states created the federal government. The states never lost their individual identity. The states never gave up their ultimate sovereignty. And so Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and many others argued that in the last resort, it was up to the states to determine the extent of the powers that were delegated to the federal government, and for them to push back and resist when the federal government oversteps. And the way I view it, people want this nice, clean system, and somebody has to decide. Well, do they really? I mean, do they really? I think if you're going to have government, I think it's healthy for there to be jurisdictions that are jealous of their own spheres and that are bouncing against each other and resisting each other and undermining each other's power and authority. Again, it gets back to this idea of monopoly, and it's almost like a free market. You want a lot of firms that are competing because that's what's best for the customer. When you have monopolies in the business world, if you could ever have a true monopoly, then you would expect the possibility of prices to rise, customer service to deteriorate, all of these things that we're fearful of business monopoly. Well, it's the same thing when a government has a monopoly. It always boggles my mind, particularly with leftists who are so anti-big business. We can't have these big oligarchical corporations, and then they want to create an oligarchical government, which is nothing but an oligarchical corporation with guns.
Right.
Blows my mind. But I think I just sidetracked myself. But so yeah, we want these competing jurisdictions. And in my book, Our Last Hope, I actually used an analogy. You probably played backyard football or backyard basketball or something when you were growing up, right? Did you ever have a referee? No, we never referee. We figured it out, We would argue a lot, I remember playing baseball, you'd argue for 15 minutes about whether somebody was out or safe, but eventually you get tired arguing about it and just like, okay, fine, he's safe, or fine, he's out. we always manage to get by without having some ultimate authority making decisions for us. I think that we could probably get by in a system where we don't necessarily have one entity that is in charge and has the final say. The entity that has that final say is always going to have too much power. So, that's the way Jefferson looked at it. Jefferson thought that the competition between the various branches was healthy, and that if the president believed in his heart that something was unconstitutional, then he shouldn't enforce it. And, even Abraham Lincoln, who I loathe, he said that at one point that the Supreme Court's made its decision, now let it enforce it. So, I think ultimately the states were expected to decide, but I think there was also a kind of a assumption, which maybe it was dumb, that the Constitution is not that complicated, really. We've made it more complicated because people in power have twisted it to their own means and ends, but it's pretty clear what the federal government should and should not be doing. But unfortunately, that's not happened. And like I said, I think I blame the states ultimately because the states have deferred more and more to the federal government because the states like the fact that they can get a whole bunch of money from the federal government to spend it on a bunch of damn political projects. And, that's probably the biggest problem that faces us in the system is that the feds have bought off the states and makes it much less likely that the states will stand up and resist, because we saw a lot more resistance to what the federal government was doing prior to the Civil War than we've seen after.
Yeah, when I was 17, the drinking age in Louisiana was 18, and I remember the federal government threatening Louisiana and telling them they were going to pull road funds for the highways if they didn't raise the age to 21, and Louisiana refused. They ended up opening up a bunch of casinos to generate revenue and to repair the roads, and it helped for 6, 7, 8 months. But eventually, those corrupt politicians start dipping into the cookie jar and lining their own pockets. And about a month before I turned 18, they did end up raising the age to 21, even though the bars in the area nullified that law. They didn't give a shit. They served to whoever they wanted to. But yeah, that control of the finances, of the income, basically bribing the states to cooperate and follow whatever edicts. I don't remember what year it was, but I remember as a kid that it seemed like all the interstate speed limits nationally were 55 miles per hour. Like there was no, and I think I remember in the 90s they finally started lifting the speed limits up to 70, locally without being punished.
That's an interesting story, because that was a national mandate in the 1970s. It was the midst of the energy crisis. I don't know how old you are. I remember that.
39. I was born in 79. So.
Okay, so yeah, I'm about 13 years older than you. So I kind of remember that whole energy crisis thing. And I remember when they lowered all the speed limits to 55, and that was in fact a federal mandate. And it was tied to road funding. But the interesting thing about it was the reason that you saw those speed limits go back up was because the federal government could never enforce that 55 mile an hour speed limit. And they actually tried. They would go and they would do these surveys, and they would, the whole idea is that if on a given highway, if the speed limit averaged a certain number of miles per hour over that speed limit, then it would be assumed that the state's not doing its job to enforce that speed limit, and then it would be subject to losing highway funds. That was how the whole thing was supposed to work. And so they started measuring it, and in the late 70s and early 80s, the average speeds were climbing and climbing and climbing. And you know how many federal road dollars actually were taken away?
None.
Zero. Yeah. The federal government never took one highway dollar away. When they realized that it was completely out of control, they just silently and quietly raised the speed limits. So it's interesting because I really wish that this will seg me into something that I thought of when you were talking about Texas. I really wish that more often states would just say, okay, federal government, do it. Because that's basically what they did with the speed limit. There was no way they were going to be able to enforce that. And they told them so. We're not going to do it. And the feds knew that if they started taking away highway funds, people were going to throw a fit. It was politically not really a viable option. So the other alternative was, we'll just raise the speed limit. I'll give you an example of where I really wish a state had just had the tiniest bit of I guess, balls to stand up. And this was back, I guess 6 or 7 years ago when the TSA introduced the naked body scanners. Remember the naked body scanners? Okay, so when they introduced the naked body scanners, then we got people that didn't want to go through the naked body scanner, so then we got the intrusive groping. And there was actually a bill introduced in the Texas House that in effect would have criminalized the TSA. It basically created a situation where the touching that was going on would be construed as sexual assault, which in fact, by definition, it is, and would have subject the TSA to arrest and prosecution, the agents. This bill passed the Texas House. It was gonna pass the Texas Senate. And then the feds got wind of it, and they sent letters. I actually have a copy of the letter somewhere, because we did a lot of reporting on this back when it was going on. They sent a letter to all the Texas senators, basically told them that if you do this, we're going to shut down all of the airports in Texas. We're going to basically turn Texas into a giant no-fly zone. And the Senate leadership caved, of course, and the bill got tabled. I wish they would have said, do it. Because can you imagine the havoc that it would have caused if they had shut down all the airports in Texas?
That is so much bullshit. They weren't shutting nothing down. No, there's no way.
Think about it. American Airlines Hub is in Dallas. Continental, which doesn't exist anymore, but Continental's hub was in Houston. You had Southwest hubs at the smaller airport. No, I guess it was at Hobby. There was another airline that had a whole bunch of air traffic goes through Texas. So let's just put it that way. It would have basically shut down the entire U.S. air traffic system. There is no way on God's green earth that the federal government was going to get away with shutting down the entire U.S. air traffic system in order to maintain its naked body scanners and its groping that everybody hated in the first place. Well, that's a prime example of where they could have just said, F you, federal government, and the federals wouldn't have been able to do anything about it.
Yeah, I mean, what is it? Bush Intercontinental Airport out of Houston alone is what, like the third biggest like intercontinental airport in the country or something like that. Like, there's a lot of traffic that's just running through Bush Intercontinental. Not to mention Hobby down 45, and then you got DFW in Dallas. Like, there's no way they could have done that. If they couldn't see through, like, that's like transparently a false threat. They're never going to follow up on that. Even if they follow up on that for a week, that's not going to last any time.
Nope.
That's ridiculous.
But unfortunately, your Texas senators are a bunch of wusses. So.
Yeah, well, that's how we end up with like a Ted Cruz's and shit. That's why Beto almost beat him. You know, I mean, if Beto can almost beat you, you're probably not doing a very good job. You know, but whatever. Right. Come rolling in on a skateboard. Can't even ride a skateboard right. Yes. But,
sociopaths, man. They're all sociopaths.
Oh, they're nuts. Except for you, Mr. Hornberger. Please run for president.
Yeah, I like him. I actually met him a couple of weeks ago in California.
Oh yeah.
He did a little speech at the California Libertarian State Convention, and he was fantastic.
Oh yeah.
He hit all the things. He hit everything: anti-war, anti-drug war, anti-Fed. I mean, the dude was right on target. So. Yeah.
You can hire Scott Horton as his foreign policy advisor and Michael Bolton.
Anybody that hires Scott Horton as a foreign policy advisor has got my support.
No doubt.
And I don't really get into electoral politics, but that's something I would get behind just because of the the outstanding messaging we would get out of it.
Yeah, no, and I've made it perfectly clear. On a couple of podcasts ago, I was talking with a guy. I'm not even registered to vote. I don't vote. I have troubles leaving the house whenever I'm at home because I'm a truck driver. But if I've thought about going and registering and voting in the primary for Tulsi. And then if Jacob Hornberger does run, then I will vote in the general. But other than that, I won't touch the general election. But I have thought about voting in the primary for Tulsi just to give them the middle finger.
Yeah.
Because they don't want anything to do with her.
I know. It's another example of somebody that is anti-war that the mainstream is trying their best to unperson. And they did the exact same thing to Ron Paul. It's funny because, I remember back in the Ron Paul days, you would see the polls and, you'd look at it and you're like, wait a minute, there's like 20% missing out of this poll. Well, those are Ron Paul's numbers, but they were ignoring him. They're going to do the same thing to Tulsi. They're going to unperson her because by God, we can't resist the warfare state. We have to bomb as many brown people as we can in order to protect my freedoms.
Mm-hmm. Well, I always laugh about that. I always laugh about that Jon Stewart line whenever he was covering the Ron Paul, the ignoring of Ron Paul, and he was like they on the screen it had first place, second place, fourth place, and fifth place.
Right.
And he goes, when did Ron Paul become the 13th floor of a hotel? Like what the heck? So anyway. All right. Well, no, actually, this actually brings something up because this might actually give some people a little bit of hope because foreign policy, the episode I recorded, I'm releasing this next Monday, is on Iran and Venezuela, and then yours is coming out the next Monday after that. But foreign policy is one of those things that just feels so hopeless. We have no chance of beating these guys back. Like, no matter, we vote, like, every time I say we, I don't vote, but every time somebody's elected, they run on anti-war messaging, and they win the election and they do a 180. I don't know if they show them like Bill Hicks' joke used to be, they bring him into a dark room, they turn on the Kennedy video from another angle so you can really see the shooter, and they turn on the lights and they're like, any questions? And just scare you into doing whatever the hell they want you to do, or what it is. How can nullification be used to fight foreign policy? Because I have an idea, I have ideas about it, but is there any way that we can spread the message of nullification in fighting this perpetual war state that we live within?
Absolutely. There's three things that pop up to the top of my head, and I'm going to try to run through these pretty quick. And these are practical measures that we've actually seen at least have the beginnings of some momentum forward. Number one is a bill that we call Defend the Guard, and a guy named Pat McGeehan, who's a fantastic. He's one of the few politicians in the world that I actually respect. He's a state representative out in West Virginia, and he's introduced this bill. And he actually almost got it to the House floor this year by doing some political maneuvering. So I think it might have passed if he had been able to get it to the House floor. But basically what it would have done is it would have prohibited the deployment of the West Virginia National Guard unless there was an actual declaration of war. So states control their National Guard units. Technically, they are not supposed to be used unless there is an actual war going on, and this is something that the states could do. And of course, the states depend on these National Guard units. I've got a friend who was in a National Guard unit here in Kentucky that just within the last 2 years went to frickin' Africa. Why is the Kentucky National Guard in Africa? Well, it doesn't need to be. Let's put it that way. So that is one. Just a small step. And what's really cool about this is it brings the topic to the forefront. And I think there's a lot more, popular support. I think there's a lot more anti-war support out there than people realize. I think intuitively people are a little bit tired of decades and decades of war. So, that's one practical thing. It's called Defend the Guard. Second thing is a bill that I actually wrote last year. It has not been introduced anywhere yet, but we're working on that. And it's called the Human Dignity Protection Act. And it's basically, to make a long story short, we found out over the last few years is that the state of North Carolina and a couple of counties were involved in the rendition of people during the Bush administration who were basically jetted off to black sites to be tortured. We can prohibit the cooperation of state and local governments with any type of torture policies. So again, taking away necessary resources from the federal government. And again, probably not going to stop torture, but is something that can elevate this discussion. And it's just a pretty cool bill. And then not necessarily directly relating to war, but relating to the surveillance state, which is closely tied to war. We actually came up with an idea a few years ago to turn off the water at the NSA facility in Bluffdale, Utah. Perfectly legitimate course of action that the state of Utah could take. That water is supplied by the county that or the city of Bluffdale, and the city has a contract with the NSA to supply the water. That contract could conceivably not be renewed, and we could turn off the water, and then they can't cool their supercomputers, and they can't spy on us. So, again, any place that you find where there is state and local cooperation, you can take that state and local cooperation away. And there's certainly areas where state and local cooperation are targeting the warfare state. So we are working on some of those issues and trying to brainstorm and come up with other creative ways to do it. The NSA thing actually was a pretty big splash there for a couple of years when the Snowden revelations were still fresh. Unfortunately, the powers that be in Utah ended up blocking that move, primarily due to the general in charge of the National Guard there. He basically got it killed in the committee. But political maneuvering is frustrating. But that's part of the ball game, and that's why you got the 10th Amendment Center. This is what we do, and we've seen a lot of progress over the last 4 or 5 years, and we're going to keep working towards it. And I'll give my pitch real quick. I would encourage anybody who is interested in learning a little bit more, just visit 10thamendmentcenter.com. It's all spelled out. And check out what we're doing. If you go to our blog, you'll see the various bills and issues that we're working on, plus just a lot of educational material. And I think people will enjoy it. And if you're really interested in what we're doing and want to support us, you can become a member of the 10th Amendment Center for as little as like $2 a month. And that helps us keep things going. But, I'm a believer. It's interesting. I just want to say that this, for folks out there going, well, I don't really want to have anything to do with something that's involved in political process or the state. I'll just tell you that this has been instrumental in bringing me from warmongering neocon to hardcore ANCAP, writing about how socialism is somebody sticking a gun in your face. So, I think there's a lot of value. This is a gateway for a lot of people who aren't going to listen to a more hardcore message, but will listen to something that they feel like is rooted in the Constitution. And then you good folks can move them on down the pathway, and we'll have more people that are pushing for liberty.
Right. And I just wanted to point out, and this is like much to the 10th Amendment Center's reputation. It means a lot that they go about their business the way they do. The 10th Amendment Center refused to sign up as a 501c3, meaning that they are a for-profit organization, which means that they do not get the tax cuts most of these organizations, most of these institutes and centers get from their donations. They do pay taxes on these donations because they figure if you have to pay taxes, they're going to pay taxes too, and that they're no better than you are. So I think that's much to the 10th Amendment Center's credit.
I'll tell you the other reason for that too is that we don't want the strings attached that come with getting in bed with the IRS. You get those benefits and it comes with a lot of restrictions. So we're like, F that. We're going to be independent and we're going to do our work. And like you said, We don't want any special treatment. We don't need the government patting us on the head. Our goal is to get rid of that crap. So.
Absolutely. Hey, I got one more question, and then I want to let you plug everything,
Sure.
and I'll definitely get you off here because we've been on just over an hour. Do you, and this is something that Scott and I were talking about the other day, is as anarchists, we talk a lot about ending entitlements, ending the state, and that charity could handle these things. So what I want to do is I want to give all my guests a chance to plug their favorite charities, talk a little bit about that charity just for a few minutes. So if you got any charity that's special to your heart, man, please let everybody know and where they can find it and check it out and all the information they need to get on it.
Ooh, that's a good one. Well, I donate. I want to touch on a couple of things. I donate to a number of organizations. One is Scott Horton. Scott Horton's fantastic, and he can always use support. And then another one that's in the libertarian world is antiwar.com. It's pretty cool to me that the main source of anti-war news and information is libertarian and not leftist. I think that's pretty cool. Charity-wise, one of the things that I give to, and this is a religious charity, and so folks that aren't religiously oriented might not be interested in this, but I don't know, you might be anyway, because it's a fantastic organization. It's called UMCOR, UMCOR. I believe I think the website is umcor.org, and it's a organization within the United Methodist Church that responds to disasters across the world. And they're generally some of the first people on the ground after hurricanes, earthquakes, flooding, things like that, natural disasters, with food relief, rescue efforts, all of those types of things. They have people that are trained to respond, and also the resources to provide things, basic needs, water, food, clothing, all of those things that you need in the midst of a disaster. The coolest thing about UMCOR is that their administrative support actually comes through the general giving of the church. So any money that is given directly to UMCOR goes to those core programs. It goes to the food and disaster assistance. So a lot of bang for your buck. And it's, even though it is technically a religious organization, and they're not out there handing out Bible tracts. They're on the ground providing the aid and assistance that people need in these disasters, no matter where they are in the world. So I've know people that have been involved in the organization, and I know people that have been helped in the organization, and I've been told that they are some of the first people. Oftentimes you will find them on the ground before the government agencies can even respond. So a fantastic organization. Let me make sure I've got the website right before I it is umcor.org, so umcor.org.
Okay, cool. All right, man. Well,
I appreciate that. That's a really cool thing that you're doing. I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, well, it wasn't my idea. Like I said, it was Scott Horton's idea, and I was like, you know what? I think I'm going to start incorporating that into my show. The last.
I'm going to tell you. I'll close out with something fun for your audience. Speaking of Scott Horton.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's an amusing antidote. So, like I said, I've said a couple of times, I started working with the 10th Amendment Center I guess it was probably about 2009, so it's been about a decade ago. And I was one of the people that kind of got caught up in the Tea Party hype. Oh my God, Obama's going to destroy the world. And had just finished up with journalism school. Wanted to get involved in something, doing some writing and stuff where I could get plugged in and do something besides, go to a protest or whatever. And stumbled on the 10th Amendment Center. I was one of these people that I was one of these Republicans who bought into the limited government idea. I didn't understand at the time that the Republicans weren't limited government, but, it was a good concept. So, long story short, I got involved with the 10th Amendment Center, and I'd been working maybe a year or so, and we were doing these series of events called Nullify Now. They were basically 1 or 2 day events where we had a bunch of speakers and workshops and whatnot. We did them in various cities around the country. Usually had Tom Woods as the keynote, and we did a Nullify Now in Austin. And So I went down there, was speaking at that, and for whatever reason, I can't, it's long enough ago that the details of why kind of elude me, but for whatever reason, we went and did something, and Scott Horton was going to come with us. So Bolden was like, hey, we're going to go pick up this dude, Scott Horton, real cool dude, known him for a long time, blah, blah, blah. So remember, I'm still basically in neocon phase here. I'm starting to, consider libertarianism a lot more, and I've got at least one foot in the door, but I'm still pretty straight-laced mainstream Republican and conservative kind of thinker. Scott Horton gets in the car. He's in the back seat sitting next to me. Bolden's in the front. I can't remember who was driving. Horton starts going off. Now, anybody that's heard Horton's pretty much always going off. But if you listen to an interview with Horton, that's pretty much Scott all the time. Scott is just, he's constantly, he's got more energy than any human being I've ever met. And he's just constantly talking about stuff. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I just remember all of a sudden he's going, fuck the state, just fuck the state. And I'm sitting here in the back seat going, oh my God, what in the hell have I gotten myself into? This guy is absolutely insane. So yeah, that was my first exposure to Scott Horton, and so I think that's pretty funny. It's kind of cool because I didn't run away, so I guess it was okay. I must have been listening, but that's my Scott Horton story. That was my first time meeting him, and I've gotten to meet him on a number of occasions since then. We've become pretty good friends. I think that's funny because I really did think he was kind of insane at the time.
He's a great dude.
So there you go. That's
one
of my favorite liberty movement stories.
I called him the other day to do some show prep for a podcast I'm doing on Iran and Venezuela, and so just to run my thoughts by him and my ideas, and we got talking for a while, and I was like, it's like really funny because I listened to all the talking heads and all the pundits and news that I used to listen to, and I'm like, these idiots don't know a damn thing. I was like,
they don't know anything.
But even still knowing they know nothing, still to this day, I have like this imposter syndrome where it's like, well, and it's that, like I was saying, it's that deference to authority. Like I'm supposed to defer to somebody else and live by their narrative instead of like using my own damn mind and critical thinking skills to decide on my own and decipher information on my own. And he's like, fuck that. 99%, or more than 99% of those guys. You're ready, Tommy. Yep, exactly. Get out there. I was like, all right, cool, dude.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, no, but he's a great guy, man. Scott's one of the best dudes I've run into. But I want to get you off here, man. I know you got things to do. I know you've had a busy weekend, and I know you got some things to plug. So where can people find you and follow you?
All right. Like I said, first place I would encourage people to visit 10thAmendmentCenter.com and check out both the main page there and the articles that are there and also the blog. And you'll get a good idea of the various issues that we are working to undermine federal power and how we're using this idea of nullification. I also have my own website. It's michaelmaharrey.com. And I have a podcast that I run off of that page. I just do it every other week. It's a 10-minute one. It's the shortest podcast that you'll ever run into, I think. But basically,
Alex Merced might be giving you a run for your money there.
Really?
Yeah, he does sometimes he does 4 or 5 minute little podcasts he puts out.
Right. Well, mine is 10. I call it Thoughts from Maharrey Head. It's primarily constitutional issues and political decentralization. Just basically rambling about whatever I'm talking about. You can also find information about my book on my website, which is Our Last Hope, Rediscovering the Lost Path to Liberty. I'm going to be releasing another book soon-ish. I'm really hoping by the end of the summer, which is going to be called Constitution 101, which will go through all of the various clauses in the Constitution that are somewhat controversial and explain what they were intended to mean at the time of ratification. So, kind of for statist nerds. But I'm excited about releasing that. So that's all at my website, michaelmaharrey.com. Also, a lot of I'll throw up articles and stuff on there that are more politically oriented. And then also I mentioned at the top of the show, godarchy.org. If you are a believer, it's a great place where we talk about Christianity and anarchism and I've got a podcast that I run out of there. I've had Scott Horton on. Trying to think of who else I've had. He was probably my biggest guest. It's kind of a mix of me talking and then also various guests. But again, more from a Christian perspective, but definitely much more anti-state than the 10th Amendment Center or or what you'll find at michaelmaharrey.com. So those are my primary things. I'm on Twitter at mmaharrey 10th. 10th is just the number. I'm the lamest Twitter person in the world, so I don't know. I'd appreciate you following me, but I'm not going to promise that you're going to get any great bang for your buck. And then I also have a professional page on Facebook which I think is at mmaharrey, where I post a little bit better. I'm a better Facebooker than I am a poster. Or if you just want to be friends on Facebook, you can look me up, and I pretty much will accept your friend request unless you're nuts.
That's how I found you. I was like, oh, hey, this guy's friends with Dave Benner. And let's do this. So,
yeah, Dave's great. Dave's a good friend.
I like his book, The 14th Amendment. I really like that book a lot.
Dave is one of those people that, not to get, people are like, oh, they're just having a conversation now. Is this podcast over? But I'd like to give a plug. Check out Dave Benner if you're out there, if you're into history, because that dude is like a history encyclopedia, especially Revolutionary War, pre-Revolutionary War, and then also the Civil War. I mean, the dude is like, also he also really knows a lot about like English history, but. Yeah, he's great. If you friend him on Facebook, just his posts that he'll do like Today in History, and then you'll get more out of that than like taking a college history course. So
yeah, really.
We'll plug Dave Benner on my interview. That's fun.
Damn straight. Dave seems like a good guy. But all right, man. Well, let me shut this down and then we'll get off here.
All righty. Well, I appreciate you having me on. It's been a lot of fun, and anytime would be happy to come back. Anytime you need somebody to ramble a little bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Write another good article. I'll get you back on
here. All right, I'll do
it. All right, buddy. We'll talk to you later.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
This is not a drill. This is an emergency.
He knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent.
I'm Tommy Salmons. This is Year Zero.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of